One second. I think we are now live. Okay, I think we're live. Okay, so we are live this hour. Incredibly, surprisingly, amazingly, joined this hour by Tim Hernandez, who is a an award-winning poet, author. I mean, we're talking about like some of the big awards, the big authorships. Really, really, really thrilled and honored. This kind of happened pretty spontaneously. So, um, wow, Tim Hernandez. I cannot believe it.
Thank you. It's really a privilege and an honor to be in conversation with you.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, I assure you the honor is 90% mine. Can you tell us about how, like your first book collection, poetry, came out in 2004, but way before that, there was Tim, the little boy who liked to write. So let's start the story where it begins.
Actually, the little boy who hated writing, to be honest. And the little boy whose mother read to him very often. I was a well-read to child. I wasn't a well-read young man, but I was well-read to, which makes a difference. My family were migrant farm workers. Growing up, we traveled a lot, and so I think my mom just had this tendency to carry books, and my father had this tendency to carry stories, and so they always shared that with us. And those things kind of are the early seeds, and then later on they're dormant, and then later on in life, they somehow emerge when you need them most. I was in my early 20s. I wanted to be a visual artist. I was painting. I was going to college, early college, just to study painting. And then things happened in life. Suddenly, a very close relative of mine, who was like my brother, was shot and killed while unarmed by the police. And suddenly painting didn't seem fast enough for me, urgent enough. I needed words. And so I actually started by writing words into my paintings. And then eventually I was like, that costs a lot. You know what I mean? Like to buy paints and canvases. If I'm just going to write words, I might as well just get a pencil and paper. And so that's how it all began for me. Early 20s. Yeah, my early 20s. And then it wasn't until later, actually, somebody pointed at me and said, "Hey, that's a poem. What you're writing there, that's poetry." And I was like, "What? Me? No, I don't write poetry." But that's how it was. And yeah, I just kept on from there. Are you there?
I'm still at technology. I was mute there. Sorry. Right. So your first collection of poetry gets published when you're about 27 or 28, correct?
I was 30. Yeah.
You're 30. Okay. So your early 20s, between 30, you publish this book. It goes on to national acclaim. It's widely celebrated. Somewhere between 20 and 30, someone tells you're a poet, and between that time and the time you publish this book, you obviously develop your craft. Can you tell us that story? How that came about?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I was writing poems, or writing things that look like poems, I guess. And one day, a teacher of mine gives us extra credit. Now, this is like I'm in community college, and gives us extra credit to go to Fresno State University, the big city of Fresno, where I'm actually not from originally. I get affiliated with that, guilty by association, but I'm actually from a smaller town that's tucked in the orange groves there, further south from Fresno. And so we went all the way to Fresno, and I saw this play, got extra credit, and I met the main actor. And I shook his hand, he shook my hand, and he looked at me, and he was a lively guy, man. He was so alive. He was like electric and had fire, man. And he looked at me and he goes, "You look like a poet." Now, I don't even know what would have made him think that, but he said that to me. I don't know. He said, "You look like a poet." And I said, yeah. He goes, "Do you write?" And I said, "Yeah, I write some stuff. I don't know if it's poetry. I write." He says, "Yeah, you know what? You should come and read next week with me and my students in Chinatown here in Fresno." And I was like, "Well, I don't go to school here, sir." And he was like, No, it's okay. Just come and bring your poems and read." So I did. Flash forward all these years, but that was Juan Felipe Herrera who said that to me, and invited me in. And I kept going back to Fresno, and he kept inviting me. Him and his wife started to invite me to their house. Pretty soon I was having dinner. Pretty soon I was laying on their couch, and I wouldn't leave. And I stayed there for a number of years, and kind of in an informal mentorship, but probably the best kind, to be honest with you, because there were no guidelines to go by. And him and his wife together, Margarita, they started feeding me books and giving me poets and poetry to read. And I was never exposed to any of that. I was literally, I was a campesino kid, a farm worker kid from further south. And but this is my first exposure to all that. And so they started getting me involved in things. He would bring me to Long Beach and perform with his students and write. And all this time, I was not formally enrolled in college. These are my mid-20s now and stuff. I was just kind of following inspiration as I go. And then one day he finally said, look, you've been on our couch too long. What's the next step for you? And we started talking about college. By then I was like 30, almost, well, no, by then I was like late 20s, and I was like looking at colleges. And by then I was taking myself a little more serious as a writer. And at that point, he's the one who first told me you should put he said, are you going to read those poems at cafes the rest of your life? Or you're like, what's going on? And I said, because I was on the spoken word circuit, traveling up and down California, doing readings and stuff. And so he helped me compile those poems into my first manuscript, which became Skin Tax, my first book. Yeah. That's how it started.
So you're kind of part of, I mean, you're kind of a link in a chain. Because Fresno is associated with these like giants of poetry, and you are definitely you're a working artist, so you're still building that legacy that will be left behind. So you're still very much in your stride, but you've already left behind a very impressive body of work. So you're kind of a link in a chain. So can you tell our audience just a little bit about the Fresno poetry writing scene in general, because people don't really know, that are outside of the writing scene, just what a powerful, I don't want to say machine, but what a powerful,
like a poetry factory.
it kind of is. Yeah. So
I don't know what it is about Fresno or that terrain, but there's a lot of history there, a lot of history of resistance in the San Joaquin Valley. It's an agricultural hub. It's responsible for over 60% of California's income, and so. And then, the San Joaquin Valley is the hub where all immigrants that's the through road that everybody passes through at some point. And of course, the San Joaquin Valley feeds the world, all the vegetables and produce that comes out of there. So I think it creates a situation in which, there is this kind of really heavy repressive state or heavy division, I should say, between those who are the haves and have-nots, the workers, the farm workers, the workers of the ag industry, and then the owners of the ag industry, the ones who run it. And I don't know, I think that, and then, early on for myself in elementary school, they used to have this great program, man. I don't know if they still have it, but it was called the Peach Blossom Festival. And they would teach all these farm worker kids essentially how to recite poetry when I was growing up. And I did this like year after year after year. And then they would, as your prize, you would get to go to Fresno State. All these different little migrant communities would go to Fresno State. They would convene there, and we'd share our poems in front of, audiences. I did that as a kid, Now, later on, I'd learned that there were writers like Philip Levine, who were actually formally in the institution at Fresno State, who were teaching poetry, Peter Everwine, Steve Yarbrough, just great folks, man. That generation, though, who was much older, it was part of Juan Felipe Herrera, Victor Martinez, Gary Soto, Dixie Salazar. A lot of writers are coming out of from that generation. But it wasn't until I met Andres Montoya, who was a friend of mine, who that I felt like the next generation had its own wave of poets also. And Andreas was out of that. He came out of that. Daniel Chacon. And then, they were like a little bit older cats than I was. And so we would be at readings, and I would see someone like Andres, and he would give me advice because he had gone to an MFA program and he returned. And I wasn't even in school yet. I was just a street poet, doing my thing. And so, but we had that kind of, I think, mentorship with one another, a really nice kind of just a kind of a nice, friendship. And, man, we kept writing. Juan Felipe really, in my opinion, I think it was Juan Felipe Herrera who really kind of bridged the gap between the institution, the university, and the community as poetry stands. Because until then, there could be a reading on campus at the university there that none of us who were in the community would attend, unless it was some big name or something, and vice versa. We would have events in the community, poetry events, and nobody from the universities would show up. No professors would show up there, nothing like that. It was just but it wasn't until Juan Felipe, I think, really kind of helped him and his wife cross that bridge for us and started to cross-pollinate those, in true spirit of what he does. Anyway, that said, that's kind of the early pollination for what was happening there. And then after Andreas passed away, later on they became a prize, the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize, which started a lot of careers for writers, for young writers. And I don't know, man, the rest is just it's just been crazy. Over the years, we just see more and more writers coming out of different places there in the San Joaquin Valley, and they all end up in Fresno, sort of being magnetized by Fresno. And yeah, now there's just a lot of writers out of there. There always has been, I guess, but yeah, it's interesting.
So part of the kind of what this project's trying to do is get like a lot of oral histories about different small independent presses,
Nice.
venues, etc. And so we've done a lot to talk about some of the LA venues because I'm from LA, so I know them, right? So I know what questions to ask. Oftentimes when I interview people from different cities, like I know the big stuff, but I don't know the tiny little details. I don't even know what I don't know. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the venues that you started at? Reading.
The first thing I can remember was, Juan Felipe was doing these site-specific performances. And I go back to him quite often because he was honestly my only exposure to the Fresno poetry scene. That's kind of my early understanding of what that looked like, how that was shaping up to be. But him and his wife were doing really he's a performance artist, and so it wasn't just that he was a poet behind a podium. He was a performance artist. So he was in the streets. He would look for alternative spaces like Chinatown, whatever in the middle of the street. We were doing guerrilla theater. And so that allowed us to create a poetry venue anywhere. And we would do that. Later on, we did this reading called The Metamorphosis, which I ended up hosting with my friend Mike Medrano, who's another poet out of there. The Metamorphosis ran from like 1999 to like 2004 maybe, or something like that. And we had a lot of poets coming out of that. And then there was like a little moment there. There was like a hiccup in time when there were about 4 poetry venues, and you could hit a poetry venue once a week. But in Fresno, even though there's a lot of poets, a lot of poets doesn't mean a lot of audience. So it doesn't translate that way. It doesn't work that way. So you would have like, poetry reading every week, but there'd be like only 5 of you attending, religiously, but there weren't that many people, audience based to kind of fill up the seats. But it was cool, man. We supported each other. I think that's what was most important about those earlier days is that, and this, I'm talking about like maybe late 90s, from 97 to like, early 2004 time. There wasn't a lot of audience for it. There were a lot of writers supporting one another. And what was beautiful about that is that, not only were we all Latino writers, but also African-American writers. We had Hmong writers involved. We had like just Korean, it's like everybody was involved, man. And there was nothing but love for one another. There was never really much, there was friendly competition on slams, things like that, but it was always love, always. And it's still like that to this day. That's one of the things I love. And I hear a lot from outside folks talking about in terms of Fresno writing community is that there's a lot of love there.
Yeah. So your book, Skin Tax, comes out. It wins the American Book Award. What happened? What happens next?
I realized I better take this serious and start reading. I wasn't really reading up until then. I was just kind of writing on instinct, man. And then I was like, I won this award, and I was like, damn, I guess I better start to really read my shit and like get, like figure this out, No, I started to kind of take myself a little more serious. Also, I started to have a family around that time. My daughter, my first daughter was born. She was born like a month before my first book came out. So they were born at the same time, and I started to feel like I needed to make something happen of that. So I went back to college, but after that, right away, even early on, right after Skin Tax, I come from a performance background also, doing theater and doing especially like street theater and stuff like that. And I had always kind of this tendency toward narratives, longer narratives. So I was writing 1-act plays at the time. And then I got a job working for the California Council for Humanities. And I was collecting oral histories going around. That was my job for about 4 years. And all those things kind of combined started to make me rethink the way I was writing and what I was writing, what value it might have had in the immediate and in the long term. I just started to think about things differently. And one of the first things I did, I remember now, was I actually sat down with my grandfather for the first time. And I just started to ask him about his life, which was a whole new thing to me, because as a poet who was just starting, I was more interested at the time in my own process, you know what I mean? But here I am sitting down asking my grandfather about his life. And man, all of that kind of experience of collecting oral testimonies, it really changed a lot for me, the direction of my writing completely. Yeah.
So when did you get into the idea of writing novels? Like, how did you
Yeah.
like what did that where did it occur to you? You know what? Like poetry's going good, but what I really want to do is direct. No, but how did
Yeah.
you get?
Well, the first manuscript, Skin Tax, was actually it was like a hybrid manuscript. It had poetry, it had like a one-act play, and it had like short stories in it. And I submitted it, and it won a contest at the James Phelan Award in San Francisco at the time, but it didn't get published. It wouldn't get published anywhere like that. And every publisher would say, "We like the poetry, more of that," or another publisher would say, "We like the short stories, more of that, but not the other stuff," And so I reluctantly picked it apart and just kept the poetry, and that's what became Skin Tax. That's what I got published as Skin Tax. But I still had these little bits of stories, and so I continued to work on them. And honestly, I would have never thought of myself as a novelist or a writer of stories. I was just kind of using that as a means of practice, really. Like I was just going to mess around with stories. I think if I ever took myself serious early on, that I was really a writer, I probably would have been too daunted by the idea. I would have probably been overwhelmed or afraid of it, to be honest with you. I kind of the whole way in the beginning, I was kind of just telling myself, you're just messing around, you're experimenting, you're playing with language. There's no seriousness to this. Just follow your impulse and your instinct and see how far you get with this. And I did. And then all of a sudden, my first novel came out in 2010, and I was reluctant to call. I kept telling the publisher, it's a book of poetry, and they were like, "We can't call it poetry, Tim. We can't market it that way." And I was just like, "No, but it is poetry. It's not even stories. It's not fiction. Don't call it that. That's too much. I'm out of here. I'm canceling the contract if you call it fiction." I was like freaked out, man. So, but they did. They kind of it's funny, yeah. They did. They allowed me to. They called it fiction, and they allowed me in my little dedication to say these poems. I said these poems, even though it's fiction. It started to change, man. And after they published that, I felt like that was the way to continue this path of writing, which is to say, not taking myself seriously, taking myself sincerely though, but not seriously, and also always allowing room to experiment and play with ideas and form. Not being guided too much by what I'm learning in the institution about writing or theory or foundation, but to be guided more by my heart and my own instinct about what language does to people, what it does to us. So for me, that's one of the things I try and keep even in my writing now, is a sense of playfulness, a sense of not being serious, a sense of exploration. Like I can go and experiment and write this story however I want. There's who's to say how, there's no bounds. And I try and keep that as much as possible. And I try and teach that too,
Right. So your book of poetry and several collections, I think was published with Heyday Books, correct?
My first book was published by Heyday Books, just that one.
Heyday Books. Okay, so Heyday Books. So that you start off with an independent publisher. By the time you write Breathing in Dust, that's going to be published by Texas Tech University. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the difference between publishing with some of the differences in your experiences, publishing with an independent press versus publishing with an academic press?
Yeah, that was a leap to me. But, I was pretty fortunate. I've heard a lot of crazy stories about the publishing industry with certain writers and stuff. But for me, I've been pretty blessed, man, to be honest. And by that, I mean that the publishers I worked with have really allowed me a lot of control over, not necessarily editing, but in the editing, I don't want control. I'm a terrible editor, so I really need a harder editor. But, like my grammar sucks. I mean, there's a lot of things about me that I'm just like, man, it's like I'm just about the story, the content, you know what I mean? Like, so I'm grateful. But aside from the editorial aspect, like the design, even the marketing, even including certain stories and certain bits of content, that for me is important to have that kind of control when I can. And I've tried for that. I've strived for that since day one. And I haven't yet, knock on wood, to run into a publisher that has pushed back on those things. They've been really, really good with me. The independent publisher, Heyday Books, I mean, they were great. And man, all power to Patricia Wakita at the time, who was really the acquisitions editor who selected my book, and Malcolm Margolin. But they're a small operation. So a lot of the marketing had to be me, a lot of it. And at the time I had the energy too. I was, like I said, doing the spoken word circuit up and down California. So I was like, hustling, trying to get that book out as much as I could. And then during the marketing of that book, my first book, I ended up moving to Colorado, 2004. And so I was hustling in Colorado with people and contacts I knew, trying to make it happen there. But with the university press, there was a little bit more help in that. There were like more, and I shouldn't say necessarily that they got the book out further, but there were bigger opportunities to be in front of larger audiences, opportunities also to be in front of audiences that I myself wouldn't have thought of. That was a big deal for me. I wanted to not always preach to the choir. I still don't. I think preaching to the choir is important, but there's also, there's a bigger world out there. And so for me, it was also about, seizing those opportunities that the university press could provide, that when you're your own marketing machine, it's very hard to see outside of your box. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little about we kind of talked about theoretically what this book is, but tell us about Breathing in Dust. What are we looking at here? What was it?
Breathing in Dust. It's basically a coming of age novel based on my experiences growing up in the San Joaquin Valley. In my head at the time when I was writing it, I was like, this is like a Grapes of Wrath, but like flash forward 50 years, or you know what I mean? Like, of course, it's nothing like a Grapes of Wrath, but in my head, I had to tell myself that, this is like it's the same community, the same region, the same people, essentially. I mean, it's not Okies, obviously, but the same, workforce, agricultural workers and all of that. But updating it, like telling folks where we're at today through the eyes of a young man growing up in that community. And so I wrote that, and the book itself, I'm really proud of it. It was really dense and rich. It's very poetic. It's very lyrical. But that's because it was my first attempt at writing a novel, coming out of having written poetry for like 15 years before that. You know what I mean? And so, and I still have that, and I'm glad. I'm happy. I love, and that's just the way I write. But it made it very difficult at times to get into, to get the book into places I had wanted it to, like high school classes. I had pictured it to be a YA novel, to be honest with you. But every time I'd send it out, people would say, we can't sell this to young adults. Like there was too much, graphic stuff and, sexuality and violence. I'm like, I was like, this is drawn from real life though. Like I was one of these kids.
That's what they're doing.
Yeah. And I would still read those excerpts to like high school classes. They would love that, man. They would be like, yeah, I can relate. But they just didn't want to market it that way. So it never got to go out as a YA novel, but that's what it is in my heart. It was for young adults. Yeah.
I had the opportunity during this reading series to talk to both Luis Rodriguez and Luis Urrea. So I got the Luises.
Nice.
And so much. Well, thank you. But so much of what you just said reminds me a lot of what they did. What they do, which is what they write about. In Luis's case, a memoir. He was also at one point in time a journalist, and in the case of Urrea, he's he's written these powerful pieces of nonfiction, but they're very lyrical.
Yeah.
They draw from their experience as a poet. So you mentioned just now that coming from poetry into writing fiction and later nonfiction, which we'll get to in your thing in 2017. But how's that practice as a poet informed you? Can you expand a little bit on how your practice as a poet, helped you really write so lyrically?
I'm grateful that poetry was my foundation, because it allowed me to experiment with everything that came after. It allowed me to make big leaps, not just in imagination, not just in form. Like I can leap in form. I can leap also from idea to idea. Poetry can be musical. Poetry can be collaborated with music. Poetry is breathing and alive, and you can walk around with it. Poetry could be anything, as we know, as you know. And that's what it really, that's the lens through which I've looked at all my writing ever since then. In fact, maybe we'll get to this, but even my most recent book, Ollie Will Call You, about this plane crash in 1948, to me, it's a book of poetry. It's a book of documentary poetics. That's how I looked at it, and that's how I structured it, was if it were a book of documentary poetics. Very much informed by documentary poetics because of that early exposure to poetry. Obviously the lyrical writing itself, some of the imagery, I'm really big on images in my writing. It took me a long time to learn how to write dialogue. I think I'm still learning, you know what I mean? And that's because poetry for me was the first instinct on how to approach narrative, how to approach a story. So the poetry, the richness of the language remains. But one of the things I most recently been experimenting with a lot, and this is actually a tribute. This is actually homage to Woody Guthrie, the folk icon, man, because an American radical, because his writing was so simplistic, so simple, deceptively simple. I mean, almost like childish writing, elementary school writing, but the message behind it so powerful and strong. And so I've challenged myself in recent years to, how do I pare down the language? How do I not tone it down, but how do I keep the energy? How do I keep the electricity? How do I keep the tone, and yet using the most spare words and minimal sort of even repetition, trying to keep it simple, So that's kind of the challenge I've issued to myself in recent years. And when I wrote All They Will Call You, that's what I was going for. Although a lot of folks are still saying it's very poetic and rich. I'm like, damn, we're very simple and pared down. But even in that, again, all of that is influenced by my time in poetry, having spent years writing poetry, and then the structure of stories, understanding how to put narrative together, how to put images together, using things like juxtaposition. Sometimes in a story, our idea is to go from A, B, not very linearly, right? We try and go in a story, we try and tell a story. But with poetry, man, we can jump around everywhere. And so I do that a lot now in my writing. It's because of poetry, yeah.
Right. With poetry, so much of what we do is just play with the length of sentences, right?
That's right.
I mean, it's so much of what we do. I mean, when you really boil it down, we play with the length of sentences, and we order our details in odd fashions. And I think that but it's almost like once you start doing that, you can't stop doing that. So even you're gonna write about a journal entry of like your day.
Yeah.
A trip to the supermarket becomes like this.
Yeah. I mean, that was something that's one of the things for me, honestly, my own personal goals. Like, it took me a while to figure out how to not make every novel or every prose piece a poem. And by that, I mean, I guess, in poetry, it's like, we're focused on word by word, or we're focused on, like, every word has its own power. That's why we use these economy of language in poetry. And in prose, to me, it's the approach is more like idea after idea instead of word for word, and that took a little bit of transition for me, of years, to figure out that what you're going for, what I'm going for when I write a story, is one idea upon another, and how do I place the ideas next to each other versus how do I place the words next to each other. But essentially, the approach to that is the same. It's just you're using different, kind of different paints. It's like acrylic versus pastel. So.
Yeah. But I mean, it becomes hard to just because when you're telling a story, you have to convey a certain information set.
Yeah.
You need them to know what you just said. It can't be like, I can't have you figure out in the car 20 minutes from now what I just said. I need you to understand that
right.
Joe woke up and had a cup of coffee, right?
Yeah.
But I don't like that Joe woke up and had a cup of coffee. I want to lie.
Right.
So that seems like it'd be an interesting transition. But but your work, it maintains its lyricism. So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that you've accomplished so much as a writer, as a poet, as a novelist, as somebody that kind of like bends genres that we're not really even sure what to call it, because so much of your work is research based, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little about the research that goes into putting, especially this collection we're talking about 2017? Can you describe the research that went into that?
Yeah, well, the research thing happened by accident also, as me following my curiosity. My undergraduate school and my graduate education were both focused on poetry. I didn't even take a nonfiction class, really. Definitely not journalism. That said, again, poetry allows me I'm sorry, hang on. Oops. As the poet laureate Juan Felipe Herrera says, that poetry also gives us a way to live, presents to us a way to live. And I feel that way also because poetry, allowed me to kind of think outside the box in terms of how I approach research, how I approach contacting people or looking for information out here in the world. There are no boundaries except for that which my own mind concocts, and so, I have to, that's just how I approach my research, very sort of, instinctual. So that said, I think the first story was Mañana Means Heaven, the story of B. Franco, who was Jack Kerouac's quote unquote Mexican girlfriend in his book On the Road, and when I like when I came up with the idea for that, it was I was at this place where, I mean, it wasn't like I could think of, what's my next book? What's my next project? How am I going to, it wasn't like that. It was just me standing there reading on the road while in undergraduate and thinking to myself, like, this dude got the San Joaquin Valley wrong. Like that's how I was thinking of it. Like Kerouac missed a lot of things. I mean, he's beautiful language, but there's a lot of stuff he missed, right?
Yeah.
And Baldwin takes him to task later on in his essay also about that. But anyway, so in looking at that, I was thinking, like I wonder what happened to this woman, B. Franco. I wonder whatever happened to her. And then I want to say about a year after that question came into my mind. I ended up having to move back to Fresno. I was in Colorado. I had to move back to Fresno for a little short, brief moment. When I got there, the curiosity kept eating at me, like, whatever happened to this woman? So I started looking up in Google at the time, like, books about her. Maybe someone wrote something about her. And her name appears in like over 22 Kerouac biographies and stuff, but nothing specifically just about her, just stuff that was regurgitated. Anyway, man, long story short, I ended up finding out after 2 years of searching that she lived down the street. She was still alive. She lived down the street from my house in Fresno.
Wow.
She lived a mile and a half down the street from my house, like in Fresno.
Wow.
And I knocked on her door, and after you can read the rest of Mañana Means Heaven, how it went down. But basically, I became friends with her and her family, and she didn't know anything about her own legacy. She didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
I began to interview her using skills that I had learned from my job back in the day of oral histories and collecting, gathering stories, and just sitting down talking with her. And then I ended up writing Mañana Means Heaven. But when I was researching that book, I was trying to locate the actual fields, the labor camp that her and Kerouac worked at in 1947, at the end of 47, like December, November. I was trying to locate where. So I was typing into the Fresno Library search engine, Selma, California, Fresno County, 1948, 47, trying to find this labor camp. And that's when this newspaper article came up, and it said 100 people see an airplane fall out of the sky, ship plunges to earth, labor camp disaster. And that's the first time I heard about, the Woody Guthrie song. I mean, I had heard the song years before, but I hadn't paid attention until that moment. And then I went, holy shit, this happened right here in Fresno County.
Yeah, right.
That blew my mind. And I ended up writing a chapter in Mañana Means Heaven about the plane crash. And at the end, it got cut out. The editorial team decided we should cut it out, which was good. I cut it out. And then I didn't realize at the time, but that ended up becoming its own book, which is All They Will Call You. Yeah.
So I want to talk about All They Will Call You. I want to talk about the research that went into Deportee, because I mean, there's such the song Deportee, or how you wrote a book out of this thing that's kind of, barely remembered, and how great that is. But before I do that, this thing you mentioned to Kerouac, I mean, you're being very generous. I mean, I think for me that what he did is a great disservice to a lot of us, because when we look at, so I wrote a book called Mowing Leaves the Grass, right? And I'm not trying to.
I love that title, man. I love that title.
But it's called Mowing Leaves the Grass for a reason, right? And the reason is that Walt Whitman was a proponent of manifest destiny in the Mexican-American War, and that's why it's called Mowing Leaves the Grass. But in the poem, the title poem Mowing Leaves the Grass, it mentions Lowry and Kerouac, right? And an assault upon both of them, and and pissing on both of them.
Yeah.
And because with Lowry, you have a situation where we're a very cool, interesting, tragic festival people to die around. Right. And in the case of Kerouac, you have the situation where there's this woman, and he doesn't even understand what she's saying, and he's projecting his own kind of maudlin feelings about how he's going to leave her and how tragic that is. And then her brother is this idiot who can't even speak. I mean, and for me as a kid, and I'm sure you have similar experience, this is the only Mexicans I'm seeing. You're making me read On the Road. You're making me read Catcher in the Rye. You're making me read Secret Garden. You're making me read Where the Red Fern Grows. You're making me read these Dandelion Wine. You're making me read all these books, a bunch of white kids. And you're like, you're a kid, they're a kid. Identify. I'm like, okay. And then the only time I ever get to see any Mexicans is in this brief moment, and it's the tragedy of Jack Kerouac having to see these simple people, and if only I could be simple like them.
Yeah.
Goodbye, simple people.
Right. Right.
That's very painful.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I took, it wasn't just the title that I took. The title, it comes from Kerouac's line in there where Sal Paradise is talking about the people, the Mexicanos, and he's saying, mañana, mañana. That's I don't know what that word means. That's all I ever hear them say is mañana. For all I know, it means heaven. And so there is a kind of sense of ownership over that, saying like, no, but for us, like mañana means heaven. For us, tomorrow is hope. It is possibility. Tomorrow, it means that. It's not that it might mean that. It's not that, sort of flippant, you know what I mean? So that, and then, one of the things too, even in the book, in the structuring of Mañana Means Heaven, I took a lot of cues from On the Road. One of the questions I got asked early on was, why is this not a biography? Why is this not nonfiction? Why did you decide to call it fiction, to go fiction? And that was a very deliberate choice, because all of Kerouac's former lovers or partners wrote their own memoir. They all wrote biographies or their own memoir, I should say, about their time with him. I didn't want B. Franco's to exist in that playing field. I wanted it to be a direct response to On the Road. So I wanted to be on that same playing field. So I said, okay, if On the Road, if the idea behind On the Road is he's using real people's lives and real circumstances to tell his version of the story, then we're going to use that same set of rules to tell B. Franco's version of the story. And so that it kind of is, it's very much a counter narrative. Yeah.
Yeah. No, definitely. Beautiful. Okay, so let's get on to the next book. All They Will Call You. So tell us about first tell the audience who might not be familiar with about the Woody, if you could, about the Woody Guthrie song, and then transition to your book.
Sorry, I got a little distracted by some of the comments here. Cubo, Eduardo, let's see who else. From Paul saying Fresno's watching. Oh, thanks, Paul. So yeah, the transition from Mañana Means Heaven into All They Will Call You.
Yeah. Well, first tell us about the song by Woody Guthrie, and then tell us about your book.
Yeah, well, in 1948, Woody Guthrie wrote, there was a tragic plane accident that killed reportedly 28 Mexicanos who were being deported from Oakland to El Centro. Plane crashed in Fresno County in Coalinga, killed everybody aboard, including the 4 American crew members. And the newspapers only said the names of the American crew members, the 4 American crew members, named them in all the newspapers, but referred to the Mexicans only as deportees. They never got their names in death. And to add insult to injury, the American crew members were all sent back home as far as Rochester, New York, from California to Rochester by train. All their remains were sent back to their families, and they had their own burials, and their families found closure. The remains of the Mexican passengers were interred in a mass unmarked grave in Fresno, which at that time in 1948 was the largest mass grave in California at the time. And so Woody Guthrie in 1948 heard about that incident. He was really big on names as, retaining our dignity and our story. And so he wrote a poem based on that incident. And he wrote that poem called Plane Wreck at Los Gatos, Deportee, in which he says, he assigns them fake names because he doesn't know who died. But he says, he tries to restore their dignity. So he says, goodbye to my Juan, goodbye, Rosalita. Adios, mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride that big airplane. All they will call you will be deportee. And so, that poem existed for about 9 years, till a young man named Martin Hoffman, a college student in Fort Collins, turned it into a song. And got that song into the hands of Pete Seeger, who recorded it. Then later on, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, everybody else, Bruce Springsteen, Willie Nelson, they all recorded that song. And so that song's existed now for, up until the time I started to search for it, that song existed for about 60 years, maybe, out in the world, who are these friends all scattered like dry leaves? And yet nobody ever answered that or thought to answer that until I guess it took the grandson of a migrant farm worker from that area to go looking.
Yeah. Tell us about that journey of going looking to find this information.
Again, it wasn't the kind of project where I said, what's next for me? It just, what happened is as I was working on Mañana Means Heaven, I kept finding, and I was doing research for Mañana Means Heaven, I kept finding information about this plane crash. So the two were really dovetailed in the most, and they were just very much dovetailed. They were not, they were one story almost essentially because of where they happened and what was happening at the time. So every time I'd look for her story, B. Franco's story, I was finding information on the plane crash. So what I started to do was put it all into a file. Now, not at all with any intention of writing anything, just filing this information for some reason. And when I was done with Mañana Means Heaven, I said, I'm just going to go look to see where these people were buried. Because my first thought was, I'm going to find out who they were. I want to know what their names were. Mm-hmm. That's got to be easy to find. Nobody's asked, I'm sure. So I went, knocked on the cemetery door, The long story short version is I ended up finding out who they were. I got the list of names of who they were. But when I found the list of names of who they were and I had it there, and then I'm standing in front of this mass burial site, which was unmarked at the time in 2010, it was just anonymous. There was no placard that said their names or anything. I was moved, man. I was just moved. I can't describe what, or people ask me all the time, what made me do this? I don't know still to this day. I'm writing a book based on that, trying to figure what that is, what that reason was. But I can tell you, I was just moved. And I said, I felt like this is wrong. And I want to find out who they were, not just their names, but their names are representation of their stories, who they were. And again, going back to my work as a oral historian or working in that area for a while, I started to kind of search around, and again, not even thinking at all, still not thinking of it as a book. It wasn't until after I had accumulated so much journaling, so much writing and information that I said, Tim, this is your book, man. Whether you like it or not, you got to work on it, and so I began to. And it was like one of those things that when you walk through a door that the universe opens, it suddenly starts to feed you more information than from places that you didn't even expect. So once I made an intentional choice to walk through that door, it was like not enough information was just coming at me. You couldn't stop it. I'd find it in people. I'd find it, just in all these places. So much synchronicity. I could be in a city and somehow that city had everything to do with the making of that song, for example. Like I was living in Boulder, Colorado, and all of a sudden I found out that Martin Hoffman's girlfriend, the man who made the songs, only lives an hour and a half from my house in Boulder. And I'm like, what? So I got to go interview her. It's like everywhere I was, that story kept finding me. So I kept following it.
Yeah.
And I wrote it. And it took about 7 years to write it. I finished it in 2017. It came out. And at the time, I found 7 family members of the passengers. And since then, I've found 4 more families. So yeah, it's been an incredible journey.
I mean, yeah, that's wow. That's quite a feat. I mean, that's quite amazing. You have such like a I don't know. It's called a good way of making money with doing what you do is to call it multidisciplinary, or like whatever. But it's just this hybrid, this activity that just flows for me very seamlessly. You just do what you do, right?
Yeah.
And that seems like to be what people kind of often describe like as having something you can't teach, but you do teach. So how do you convey what is your teaching style like when you're teaching people to be writers, poets, authors, whatever it is that their discipline is? How do you as such just a natural someone that naturally just combines all these different disciplines, how do you teach that?
Yeah, that's been a challenge for me because when I began, I've been teaching now for about 8 years in the, in college and higher education, formally teaching for 8 years. But I was always sort of an invited guest and author, and I'd spend a day with students, things like that. But in the last 8 years, I've really come to try and hone what I'm doing, how to make sense of it for myself so that I can teach it to others. And, it all comes back down to instinct, because one of the things that I feel like, having gone through 2 writing programs myself, happens a lot is we pay a lot of attention to the head. You know what I mean? We pay a lot of attention to the intellect, to theorizing, to the theoretical, to the foundations, all these things, technique. And it's all cerebral. And my approach is much more, I think, holistic. My approach really is more about how do we use all of our bodies, all of this as a total mechanism for recording information and also for outputting story, right? Because we tell our stories the moment we walk into a room without having said a word, our story begins to unravel, And so those are some of the things I try and teach students now is how to go back to instinct. So for example, sometimes we'll just do like observational writing, very descriptive. We'll go out into the courtyard in the middle of the campus and I'll just tell the students, use your 5 senses and describe what you see. And then after they do that for 15 minutes, I'll say, okay, now use your 6th sense. And then they're just like, what? And I'm like, let's talk about the 6th sense. What are you intuiting right now? And then so we'll, I'll provide information on that as well. We'll do some readings and look at certain, aspects of what that means. But I want them to also understand that there is something just inherent within them, within each of us, that is a natural gifted storyteller, that is a natural factory of stories, and also that we are naturally recording information with our entire bodies. whether we intellectualize that or not. That's what we are doing. So then our job is to become aware of how to hone that total mechanism, which I'm calling a mechanism, but it's just the way that's one of the ways I can think of it. But so we do a lot of meditation also, because it is about an awareness, a sense of awareness, a sense of broadening one's awareness outside of what we think only, but also how do we feel in the moment. Spatial awareness is a big thing I talk a lot about. We feel way different when we're standing in the middle of a meadow in the middle of Colorado than we do when we're in downtown LA. Energy wise, something shifts inside of us. We need to pay attention to that. So those are kind of some of the ways that we perceive information. When it comes to writing, I'm like, look, and this is kind of frustrating for some students, I'll admit, but I'm always like, look, in my class, I'm not gonna focus on like, this is fiction, so I'm not a purist, and here's how we look at fiction, or this is poetry, let's just only talk about poetry. I'm more like, look, what do you have to say? Let's put it down in words, and later on we'll let the content and stuff dictate what form it takes. But let's not start with form, because then you start by starting with form. You start by putting boundaries on yourself before you even get to what the idea is. So for me, it's always about what are we trying to say? What is the idea here? Let's use language however we need to, and then along the way, we'll figure out the form. And sometimes it just looks formless, like a glob of language, you know what I mean? And so be it. But sometimes it turns out to look a lot like a poem. Sometimes it turns out to look a lot like a short story, and so that's my approach in almost all my classes. They'll say, Professor Hernandez is teaching poetry. And I'm like, yeah, but fiction writers and nonfiction writers are welcome. It's like, It's all going to come out the same, man.
Yeah, that's fantastic. No, it's funny. We actually, in the process of doing this, I actually interviewed a physicist. And he had the exact same kind of approach that you're talking to storytelling, that we're already storytellers. You're saying we're already storytellers. He said we're already physicists. Like figuring out how long it's gonna take you to go through traffic as being a physicist. Like knowing that, like, to move, if you're gonna like drop a bowling ball, move your foot, makes you a physicist, right? It's just a question. It's just a question of getting to the next level of higher and higher levels of complexity, right? So and that's it. So we're already storytellers. You come and you when you complain, you're telling a story. You're like, hey, it should have been this way, but it was that way, and that's wrong. Like, that's a story, right?
That's right, man. And a lot of us, we just need permission, to tell that. I don't know why, but we do. We need permission to tell that, and we get into a classroom, and for me, it's like you have permission to cross all those boundaries and explore, with some intention. Yeah.
Yeah. So Lorna D. Cervantes joins us, and she says Boulder. She's asking a question, Boulder. So tell us about your time in Boulder.
Hello, Lorna. Yeah, Boulder was it was a real pivotal time for me, man. I have nothing but love for that community. I know that community creates a lot of kind of there's always you're always either on one side or the other, usually, generally speaking, because it's an affluent community. It's a progressive community, but a lot of the folks have money there, and so a lot of the communities of color are literally. I haven't been there. I haven't lived there. I should say this first. I haven't lived there in like 6 years or something, but a lot of the communities of color are pushed to the margins. It's a big tourist industry also, so we're working the tourism, and the ski industry and the hotels and all of that. That said, though, when I think of Boulder, I actually think of my own autonomy. I think of coming to a sense of who I am as an artist. That's what the city means for me, and it has a lot to do with Naropa also. Plug to them. Which I know is also a kind of a school in and of itself that has a lot of sort of debate around it. But for me, Naropa, man, I got nothing but good stuff to say about it. I loved my teachers there. I was grateful. But when I went to Naropa, to be honest with you, I wasn't looking for a writing school necessarily. I was looking for an experience that was unfamiliar to me. I wanted to know what it was like to be deep in meditation. That was what I went for. And I got that there, more than the writing, because I came from Fresno and I was friends with a lot of really great writers like Victor Martinez and Juan Felipe. So I felt like the writing part of me was satiated. I was going now to meditate, to learn how to still my mind and kind of come to a different place. And I found that there. So Boulder for me represents those things, it's also green. And so I was able to breathe a lot more. I raised my children there. We didn't even live in the middle of town. We lived further out in the countryside where you could go outside of your house and find a trail anywhere, coyotes running past your house. It was really a lot of nature. And so for me, man, that time and Boulder, that Boulder County, all of Colorado represents a time of sort of awakening, of coming of age, and just finding my own voice.
So I want to ask you this question because you're kind of unique. The way in which you write makes you kind of unique in this way. Because oftentimes I'll have people on and I'll just ask them what advice do you have for young writers and blah blah blah. Right? But for you, I want to ask you this: what advice do you have for people who are kind of experienced writers in one field, right, and want to
Mhm.
get into another? Let's say they're a journalist and and they've done well, but they want to in the last chapters of my life, I want to be a poet, or in this next
Right.
chapter, but I really want to do is write a novel, but what I really want to do is this, but what I really want to do is that. What advice do you have for people like that who
Do it. That's the advice. Do it. Do it. If you need permission, now is the permission. You know what I mean? Like now is the time. Because I have students like that also. I have one of my students right now is a journalist actually. I was gonna say a journalism major, but he's a journalist. He's lived 20 years or something as a journalist, and he's like, I want to write this novel now. And I'm like, yeah, do it. That's the thing is, at the end of the day, what we need out in the world are good stories, are honest stories, authentic stories, stories that give us a fresh perspective on things, that we perceivably feel we understand already, or that we've set our minds to. Our minds need to be disrupted. Our thinking needs to be agitated a little bit. And so we need all sorts of stories. And so, I say do it. For me, it's not even a question. There should be nothing to hold anyone back. I mean, and here's the thing: is writing. You can write anything you want. You can write all day long anything you want. When it comes to publishing, then you have to think a little bit more strategically in terms of where is this going to go? What am I going to call this? But don't think of any of that right now, because that's just going to hinder you. That's putting a restraint around you before you even get to that. Like I said earlier, get to the idea. I say just write it without thinking of publishing or anything. Just write your story, write whatever you want. And then, once you have a good solid draft and you start to rework it, then you can start thinking a little bit about what you might call that and where that might be sent out to. But the writing of it, we can do that. Anybody can. We can paint a picture. We can do whatever. We can play some songs. We can sing. No matter how terrible I sound, man, I'm always singing in the shower. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, in the shower, man. I'm a concert. Like, I'm like, I'm holding my own concert there. When I come out, my kids tell me, "Yeah, Dad, stick to writing."
Well, one final question. I appreciate you giving us so much of your time and giving so much information to chew on. But you've gone on to national acclaim. You've gone on to do things and really become one of these writers that people talk about, right? They talk about each other too. But you started off in the venues, and your first book was published on independent press. Can you talk about the importance of these venues and the independent presses for people just getting their start, getting their feet wet?
Oh man, they're both vital for the same reason. That they give a forum to voices that otherwise are overlooked or intentionally discarded or intentionally ignored, or even intentionally covered up, obscured because of the fear that people have, the fear that mainstream America has or might have, when we speak the truth. And so independent publishers they're picking up that slack. That's what they do. Whereas you try and send a book like, I mean, this is just an example from a personal point of view, like All They Will Call You, which to me I felt like was a very kind of universal book, and it would be acceptable by everybody. You send that to a big publisher, they're trying to make changes about, like, for one, language. It needs to be written more to like a 6th grade level. So some of the mainstream publishing that I have just found out along the way is really kind of trying to condense the way we think, the way we write. They're trying to really kind of, I think, dumb us down in a lot of ways. Whereas independent presses, man, they just go for it. They take risks. They take big risks with intellectual thinkers, with hardline writers, with people who are really doing some solid internal work as much as external work. And so I think forums also, like venues, also provide that same. I came up in that, spoken word venues, cafes, cultural centers, wherever you could do that, wherever you had a mic or a little stage, that kind of place is invaluable. I mean, that's where we find community. That's where we share ideas. That's where we inspire one another to keep on. That's where we find support. And man, those things, as as common as they should be, are revolutionary. Are revolutionary. You know what I mean? Community support, kindness. All that kind of exchange of dialogue. Whoa, man, that's revolutionary. You know what I mean? Like that's where we are. And but those things are very, very vital. Without that, I'd be afraid of what this place would look like.
Yeah. Definitely, Tim. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so grateful that we had this opportunity to talk and do this and share this with the audience. And we're going to send it out to all the corners of the internet as we can. But I want to, before we go, I want to ask you to tell our audience where they can find your work and where they can find these wonderful things we've been talking about.
Well, right now you can hardly find it because everything's closed. But you can find them at bookstores. You can find them online too. You should probably, the best place is to go to the press itself. University of Arizona Press has my last 2 books. I also just got done pinning this deal for an audio book for All They Will Call You. So that's going to come out probably next year, late next year, audiobook on that. My books of poetry, the first 2, Skin Tax and Culture of Flow, are discontinued. They're not publishing it anymore. The Natural Takeover of Small Things, my 3rd book of poetry, you can find that with the University of Arizona Press also. They've been big supporters of my work, and they're just good friends and good folks. But yeah, I'd say go to their website. That's where you can find my books.
Okay. Go to Tim Hernandez, TimZHernandez.com?
Yeah.
TimZHernandez.com.
Yeah.
We'll drop the link in the description, in the chat box down here. So
very cool, brother.
And it's been a blast. I mean, I'm really honored.
Thank you for your work, Matt. And you keep writing, man. And we got to do a review of your book on Words on a Wire. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. I'll have to send you a copy. So my book again, since you opened the door for this, is Mowing Music Grass. It's published on Flower Song Books. Everyone should go to check out Flower Song Press, Flower Song Press now. FlowerSongPress.com. Wonderful collection of books. Not just me. Everyone's great. Really good though, but everyone else is great too. So
it is, man. We look forward to interviewing you for that as well. But thank you for having me on this, Matt, and keep up the good work, man.
All right, we'll be talking soon, Tim. I appreciate it.
Yep.